Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's our privilege to be hosting Professor Kathryn Draeger. She is the statewide director for the University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnership and adjunct professor of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. She oversees statewide programming in sustainable development, including clean energy and sustainable ag and food systems. Dr. Draeger is currently principal investigator on USDA-AFRI-NIFA grant to develop innovative supply chains for locally produced food as well as other sustainable ag-related efforts. She has been a Bush Leadership Fellowship and a MacArthur Scholar. She served as an Environmental Protection Commissioner in Iowa and was appointed to the Governor's Roundtable for Sustainable Development in Minnesota. Before joining the university, she founded two successful corporations, Sustainability International and Environmental Grounded. In 2007, Kathy and her family moved to rural Big Stone County, Minnesota to live and farm sustainably. Kathy holds a doctorate in water resources and master's in soil science from the University of Minnesota. So we are privileged to have her today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right. I don't know the meeting. There we go.
Did you share your screen?
Okay. And is there a camera that I should be trying to stay in? Nope,
No
camera.
You can't
Okay.
anywhere.
All right. Good. All right. Hello. It's very nice to see you. I'm always welcome the opportunity to talk about space weather and making the case today for why we should be looking at this in the context of disruption. And I focus on agriculture, but I think this has a lot of implications for the International Institute for Biosensing, in that right now, one of the asks I'm going to make from you today is NOAA is actually doing a survey of users of GNSS and GPS data in order to make sure that the research and the tools that they're creating actually will help serve a number of communities. Oh, there we go. So quickly, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about space weather and solar storms. I know I'm just looking at 4 people in the room. I know 2 of you have heard extensively about solar storms, but have you encountered the science of space weather and solar storms in your professional work?
As a hobby.
As a hobby?
Right.
Like,
Northern lights are coming, the solar storms.
Yeah,
for sure.
Okay, so the aurora is your gateway.
Yes.
Aurora borealis is your gateway into solar storms. I want to talk now about why this is a timely topic and why those of us who are located in Minnesota, this is very Minnesota specific implications. I want to talk a little bit about the space weather impacts on agriculture, and then a little bit of learnings from past disruptions, and then one of my interests, of course, is the planning for a resilient food supply. So assuming folks know our sun, and as I was introduced, you can see my background is as a soil scientist and a water resource scientist, all of which are very earth science focused. So it was a big revelation for me, who spent my time looking down at the ground and water, to then orient my research interest towards the sun, which I had always considered in basically a variable that you never needed to take into account in looking at food systems or supply chains. The sun was the one thing that was just going to remain constant. But in fact, the sun constantly has sunspots from which solar winds originate, which then you can see in this graphic, the solar winds come towards Earth, and then also solar flares that emit actually coronal mass ejections, which then are carried to the earth, and they interact with our magnetic shield, which is what creates the aurora borealis. But we're very lucky to have the magnetic shield we have that protects us from a lot, in fact, almost entirely all of the impacts of solar storms. So the United States has a space weather prediction center out of Boulder, Colorado, and they're in the business of predicting what space weather is going to be. And then we also, just like in hurricanes, we have a scale, so that you might have a minor solar storm all the way to extreme solar storms. And there is an effort to try to predict those, like a day or two in advance. But from all the researchers I've talked about, the recipients of NSF grants, other people who are really trying to predict solar storms, that it is a pretty difficult phenomenon to predict. So, and I'll just give you an example. I took a couple screenshots. These are 2 days apart. The predictions on the top, these 3 green G's, this was the predictions for a day. This was about a year ago. And I just happened to grab a screenshot for another presentation. And it was like, okay, no solar storms in the work. By the time I gave the presentation, about 18 hours later, we were already having a G3 storm, which is a pretty moderately large storm. So you can see, even with our best of science at this point, we are struggling to be able to predict these storms. So this was just yesterday, actually. There were predictions that we were going to have a G2 storm yesterday. We'd had a few solar flares, and we'd had some large sunspots that were bringing the solar wind in. And so 2 days ago, we were predicting a G2 storm, when in actuality, we ended up having a G4 storm, which is a relatively serious storm. So I just pulled this off of the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center website. So yesterday, infrastructure operators have been notified to take action to mitigate any possible impacts. So who are those infrastructure operators? I will tell you in this case, speaking to one of the directors at the Space Weather Prediction Center, he jokes about it, he calls it like their bat line or whatever like is in Batman, but they have a contact list of the 20 largest electrical utility grids. And when they see that something like this is going to happen, they are on the line with all 20 of those electric utility grids so that they can go to work and do what needs to be done to protect their grid systems. So yesterday, they were on the bat line and they were talking to those grid operators to give them the heads up that, kind of unbeknownst to us, we actually were experiencing a G4 storm. It's also, and I'm not as familiar with the satellite community, but also I imagine that there's some large satellite companies that also, because these storms also create a lot of drag on satellites, which, if you remember all the dramatic YouTube videos of all the SpaceX satellites coming down, that was as a result of a solar storm. Space weather as well. So what are the impacts of these solar storms? So in a nutshell, they really can range from beautiful, like we just said, like your entryway probably to space weather is the aurora borealis. And we've had some wonderful, the last year and a half has been great for seeing auroras. It's been really nice. And they can be annoying. I'll give you an example of that later. But there's also opportunities for these storms to be catastrophic. So we got a full spectrum of the range that the impacts can be. So what is that annoying? What are some of those annoying things? Like glitches, right? Like, shortwave broadcasting, aviation communications, weather stations. These are things that can be impacted by low-level storms, like that R3 storm that happened. But also, there's increasing research that maybe a lot of what we're seeing in flight delays can actually be linked back to solar storms. That whether that's a glitch in their communications or their GPS, they're like, hey, we're just going to wait a few minutes. We're having something not going on the screen. It's not necessarily identified as being attached to a solar storm, but so they actually in this paper they estimate what the percentage they believe of delays are related to solar storms. So there's things like that. Last May, so May in 2024, we had one of the largest solar storms that we've seen in quite a while. In fact, I've since been appointed to the White House Science and Technology Office's Space Weather Advisory Group. And when we met in September, we actually got to meet at the White House. We actually named the first solar storm. So just like we name hurricanes, we are now naming solar storms. So we named our first solar storm. It's called the Gannon storm. But there are estimates that that solar storm maybe had as much as $500 million in impact in the agriculture sector. And I'll give you some examples what caused that impact as we go on. Since then, there's also been one other paper that's been published. So that's, you know, that's kind of the range. Like you might have some radio shortages, radio blackouts. You might have some disruption to agriculture, but there could also be some really catastrophic impacts because of solar storms, mainly on their impact on communications and satellites and the electric grid. Now, as far as us humans, it's really uncertain. For the most part, for years, we've been saying solar storms don't really have any impact on human health. You know, there are some researchers looking at that and maybe testing that assumption to make sure it's a correct assumption. That's what science does. But, you know, in terms of your pets and your human health and your plants, solar storms don't impact us at that level. It more affects our larger systems like satellites, electric grid. So I'm brushing up against my mic, sorry about that. So along the lines of the more catastrophic impacts, one of the largest that we know about was called the Carrington event. And I probably Emily and Maggie have heard me talk about a Carrington event, but I don't know if you heard of Carrington events. All right. So Carrington event is really the first solar flare that was recorded in the West. So a researcher, Richard Carrington in England, he was actually drawing, they had a way that they could draw on by hand what the sunspots looked like. And actually at Morris, they have the piece of equipment that he was, like, not the exact one, but they have a piece of equipment he was using to draw the sunspots. It's pretty cool. And he happened to see, as he was doing this, he actually saw the solar flare burst from the sun and was like, oh, that's interesting. But then 18 hours after that, the auroras were seen almost to the equator, very close to the equator. Every place on Earth where there were telegraph stations, they were shocking the operators. Some of them started on fire. They, you know, put out like, shut them down, disconnect them. But even those that were disconnected from their electrical sources, they were still functioning because there was enough charge in the system to keep them running. And this was worldwide. Now keep in mind, at that time, we didn't have a lot of telegraph stations like around the equator. So we don't really know because, you know, in Africa and parts of South America, we just didn't have that infrastructure yet. And an event the size of the Carrington event, according to NASA, there's about a 12% chance of this level event every decade, including this decade. So, you know, 12% is not 0.12%. It's not, you know, 50%, it's 12%, but it still bears some consideration. And really, if we had a Carrington event today, we really don't know if our infrastructure would respond to it, but some US government estimates are that it could take 1 to 10 years to completely restore infrastructure. Is this one from yesterday? So this is why, so this is a map that is put out by both USGS and NOAA that actually shows the geomagnetic reaction for these solar storms and our terrestrial you know, with the Earth. And this is a pattern over and over again. You can see where Minnesota is right in the middle of the continent. Minnesota is always the hot spot. Whenever we have solar events, whenever there's solar storms, Minnesota is probably in almost all of North America, although you can see higher up in Canada that there are, it's really a center for geomagnetic storms. And there's 2 reasons for this. As you can guess, since those, you know, when a storm hits, they hit at the poles and they are strongest at the poles and they mitigate as they go towards the equator. Just like you see, farther north you are, the more you see the auroras. That's your visible manifestation of the solar storm. And that's why we almost never see them, farther south than about, the bottom third of the country. So Minnesota being one of the northernmost parts of the United States, so that's why we have, higher range, but also we have iron ore in our bedrock, and that iron ore connects with these geomagnetic storms, which amplifies that effect and really focuses it. So Minnesota is really truly, the front line for solar storms and geomagnetic storms that result from solar flares. Further, we are building out our electric grid in a way that is adding a little more hazard to our area as well. As you can see, if you just look at this map where the brighter colors are the more impact, you can see that we are really the epicenter of even the infrastructure that we do have built is actually quite vulnerable to electric storms. So this is a report that came out that talks about the event of a 100-year storm. So just like we have floods, we say we have our 100-year flood, 1,000-year flood, 500-year flood. This is what we could expect as far as impact on our electric grid from a 100-year storm. So you can see that Minnesota is just front and center in that. So space weather is a relatively new area of study. I actually asked and confirmed that this was true because the chair of the Space Weather Advisory Group I sit on, she also worked for the Obama administration. And I said, is this a true story? President Obama was reading the New York Times about space weather and solar storms. And he went to his National Security Council and said, is there any there? And they did a little research. They came back and said, Mr. President, yes, in fact, that is actual, hazard to the United States. And that's when, under the Obama administration, we started the Space Weather Operations Research and Mitigation subcommittee of the White House, which is every federal agency works together on what we need to do to mitigate, prepare for space weather events. So that came to be under the Obama administration. When Donald Trump was elected president, he doubled down on it. And then when President Biden came into administration, he doubled down again, increased the infrastructure for doing this work. That's when the SWAG was started that I serve on. And then now under the Trump administration, President Trump actually took one of the members of the SWAG who is actually sitting on his national security now. So you can see that it's the bipartisan continuation of interest in this topic is, in my mind, an indicator that we as scientists and people interested in resilience have good reason to pay attention to this as an area for research and mitigation and preparation. Anyway, as I was saying, I'm just totally geeked out and very happy to be on the Space Weather Advisory Group, the 15-member panel that represents end users, commercial providers, and I represent academia. It's really crazy that they've got a soil scientist and extension person along with the space exploration and applied physics laboratory. So it's an interesting group to sit on. But you can also see we have Lockheed Martin, Dominion Energy, which is the largest energy provider in the United States. So that we're actually trying to incorporate some of those people that are potentially some of those sectors that are most impacted by space weather. So, and I don't know, I should include this, but my children, this is an actual Snapchat I sent to my children yesterday because of the G4 storm. They often get these kind of Snapchats. And I was like, G4 storm. At the same time, we had the Zoom disruption.
Was it?
No one knows. No one knows, but it literally happened like at the same time. So, just saying, and, I get a lot of eye rolls back and, whatever. So, anyway, so I'm going to just briefly talk about the impact of space weather on agriculture. And especially those of you who work with data, you may be wondering, like, where is this going? Apple trees, other items how does this fit in? So first off, one of our agricultural researchers told me that, when he was planting his experimental field site that he had firsthand experience with the magnetic storm screw up with his auto steer and auto trip when he was planting his seeding trials. Very annoying indeed. I mean, these are really precision, like within, you know, centimeters for these research fields. And he had a year of data that was messed up because the GPS, GNS systems. What do you use in your field? GPS or GNSS? GPS, okay. And so there has been GPS in agriculture has been on a rapid increase through the years. I mean, really, how we've been monitoring, like the first GPS satellites, you know, were released in the mid-70s. And then we started applying this technology to agriculture, you know, in part for sampling, for experiments, for research was the kind of the front load. But now, like automatic guidance on your equipment is really common. And some farm equipment is being built by John Deere, like the planters. They need to have a GPS lock before they'll release a seed. So if GPS is down, you can't release seed. And there are no manual overrides, which is, again, these things when we think about the unintended consequences, because we just considered that these are all of our infrastructure is just bigger, better, faster, and in perpetuity. And we don't think that maybe we might need to keep who would use a manual override on their 48-row planter? If you don't have GPS, why do you do it in the field? So we simply haven't thought through what could be some unintended consequences of this. And I work with a Dr. Terry Griffin out of K-State, and he works specifically in precision agriculture. And this graph shows the uptake in basically GPS use, GNS use in agriculture. And by his estimates, about 70% of all crops in the United States are now planted using GPS. So that news article I showed you earlier about the Gannon storm in May 2024, that shut down agriculture in a swath of 5-state swath throughout the middle of the country. And it shut down planting because it happened in May. And that's when everyone was planting throughout that region. It literally stopped planters throughout the region. And that's what resulted in that $500 million impact to agriculture was the delay in getting crops in the field. So there is a real connection between this type of technology and what we are seeing in the field. Now, for my work, this is of interest. But at the same time that we're seeing this huge uptake in use of technology for agriculture, we're also seeing just a radical drop in our skills and our knowledge base for agriculture as well. So at the time of the last Carrington event, about 70% of the American workforce was engaged in agriculture. And now we're at about 1%. And of that 1%, you can see that about 70% are using GPS. So we really, like if you had to say, okay, GPS is down, we still need to get crops in the food because we still have people to feed. Who has the skills and knowledge to be able to actually do that? And who has the equipment anymore that you could use to be able to plant crops without using this level of technology? So my work focuses on disruption. And I'm just going to really quickly harken back to COVID because we saw really unprecedented disruptions in agriculture and food supplies. And I mean, some things made the news, like we were at that point euthanizing 10,000 pigs a day. We actually had to change some shipping rules in Minnesota to be able to transport that number of carcasses to landfill. It was, you know, not everybody saw this happening, but we were working in supply chains and we were getting calls. And so we came up with kind of a 4-point strategy for addressing supply chains. And I'm just going to go through them really super quickly. Number one, pull food into households and communities. So we created an emergency 14-day meal kit that was shared all around the world tens of thousands of times. And it was like repurposed by, you know, like a group of vegans called me like, we want to make a vegan meal kit. And we just made it all available for anyone around the country and actually around the world. So that was the one thing, strategy one. So that when we talk about agriculture and food supplies, like making sure that you have some level of household and community food assets. Number two, kind of fortify or harden the existing assets that you do have. And for our work, we really looked at how we made sure that small town stores were able to stay open and functioning during a disruption like a pandemic. The third strategy was build direct farm to grocery store supply chains so that we didn't have to depend on longer supply chains in order to get food into the grocery stores. And then the project that we're working on now, which is how do we create alternative regional supply chains? And I just presented this concept again this week at the Carlson School of Management to a supply chain class, just to say, you know, we have a very elegant and well-functioning global food system. Emily's apples, I don't know, is there a tag on your apples in there, Emily?
No.
You know, it's hard to say where that apple came from, probably Washington, maybe New Zealand, right? And that's our plan A, is that we can have apples, cantaloupe, strawberries, any time of the year round. That's our plan A. But what are some plan B food supply chains if we needed to have a more regionalized and local food supply? So that's one of the things we're working on is how do we look at supply chains through a different lens? So, and of course, I believe, and I think it's true that the University of Minnesota plays a big part in helping us to build those connections so that we have acknowledge the assets that we have and the skills and the knowledge, and then think about how we could fall back on those should we need to. When I was in Washington, DC, I actually heard a presentation from FEMA, and FEMA was talking about how they're trying to plan for solar storms and what they're doing to kind of get themselves ready for this kind of disruption. And they said, like in front of this pretty astute group, that they were going back in and pulling fax machines out of their basements. And they were hooking up because they had found that their satellite phones were unreliable and that they had had situations where there was hurricanes at the same time as solar storms and they lost communication. And so they were like literally training their staff on how to use a fax machine because fax machines and landlines were more reliable than satellite phones in certain situations. But it was really astounding. Like, when's the last time you used a fax machine? Have you ever used a fax machine?
I did, when I was in AmeriCorps, I worked in like a very low tech office in Iowa for a while, and that was the only time I ever used
Use a
one.
fax machine. Yeah. So but it was fascinating to think that here's FEMA like preparing for this by pulling fax machines out of the basement. And then it made me ask myself, so what is the equivalent of a fax machine for agriculture? FEMA can pull a fax machine out of their basement, but what have we got for agriculture? And it just so happens that like not long after that, I saw this farmer, which is such an unusual sight. I drove by, I'm like, what the what? And I went and I had to drive back again because I'm like, what is, like, I haven't seen a farmer on a tractor like that in a long time. And I took a picture of it, but that's probably the equivalent of our fax machine for agriculture. And not every farm even would have access to that scale of implements, you know, as well as things like grazing and livestock and animal husbandry, which are also increasingly rare. So, but there are opportunities to mitigate. And I feel like as this topic gets more and more attention, we will look for other global solutions. New Zealand actually has been trying to really put more mitigation into their electric system, and they've had some success with this. For example, they reduced their basically the outages by about 32% by adding targeted capacitor blockers, like adding components to the grid that were able to help to reduce the impacts of the solar storms. In the United States, the Western Power Administration, which is all of our hydropower, they're actually testing new substations to see if they can block geomagnetic induced currents. So, you know, they're actually testing this, putting it out on the landscape. And so I read that, like, they were like testing it in 2 substations, and I also sit on a rural electric co-op board, which serves about 4,000 farmers. And we have 13 substations for 4,000 farmers in like a three and a half county area. And WAPA serves about a third of the United States, and they're testing it on 2. So like the scale of the test is, it's important, and we're gonna learn a lot, but it's still a little bit underwhelming in terms of actually being able to mitigate should we have a large solar storm. And then I also have some concerns that about how we build resilience into the clean energy transition, because there are 2 things that create vulnerability in our electric grid. Number 1 is the length of the lines. So from where you generate the power to where the power is used, the longer that distance, the more that the currents can build up on the lines and blow out your infrastructure. So and now what we're seeing is like we're developing a lot of wind in the Dakotas, and it's going as far as Chicago, and that's a really long ways, you know, like we have the nuclear power plant in Monticello that's feeding the Twin Cities. That's a short distance. But once you start importing power, and that is the strategy we're using. I also sit on the Great River Energy Transmission Committee, and so I'm on the front row seat having some of these conversations, and that is our strategy. Long lines, but also when we increase the capacity of the line, it also increases the opportunity to have larger currents on the line that then can cause impacts to the system as well. And again, just pointing out that what do we see in terms of vulnerability, like this map I showed you earlier from the US Geological Survey, you can see that we're a hotspot. And if you map that to our wind resource transmission lines, like you can see this, those bright spots. It is in part our vulnerability is the strategy we're using to get wind energy from where the wind blows to where people live. And further, there's a lot of excitement that we are, as part of Great River Energy, we are building the first 765 kilovolt electric transmission lines. And this is a big deal. People are excited about this, but this is exactly the strategies that make us most vulnerable to solar storms as well. So yeah, so it's complicated, and you know, we did have a session at Great River Energy a couple months ago about how they are hardening the system for geomagnetic storms, and it is on their radar. So kind of in summary, like in general, dispersed energy systems are more protective of us as a society in terms of having, you know, where the electricity is produced to where it's used. The more you can lessen that, the more you can have a dispersed energy system rather than a centralized long line system. I also believe that, like a fire drill, we should be thinking through our options, practices, and we should be prepared. I actually was invited to speak to Homeland Security in the US Department of Agriculture in 2023 because they did their continuity of operations exercise around space weather. So I was able to kind of talk to them about, and so we see that government agencies are kind of practicing doing tabletop exercises around space weather. And like I said, it's a new field and we're still trying to incorporate it into our thinking. But for me, also one of the things is what skills and knowledge should we be preserving and cultivating? I was able to join the National Space Weather Conference, which is attended by about 450 astrophysicists and me, a soil scientist, and the National Security Council and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. She asked that, she stood in front of the group and she said, what does success in national resilience look like in the face of a Carrington event? And I wrote this on a whole bunch of big sticky notes. I've got them on my house walls and my office walls, because I feel like that's a question I want to continue to hold in front of me, to think about what does resilience actually look like. So what are some things that we're talking about? I think we haven't even defined the range and duration of potential impacts. I mean, agricultural technology, what does that mean for planting, production, storage, processing, distribution of food? That's gonna change radically by geographic regions. I mean, there may be no impact at all to a crop, but a citrus crop in Florida, no impact at all. They don't even have a blink on their electric system. And we in farm country might not grow, we might be able to grow wheat, but not be able to necessarily process it because our grid is down for months on end. Because the heartland and some of those northern areas are, going to be more vulnerable to different kinds of events. So it's going to vary by geography. And then what is our plan A, plan B, plan C for agriculture and food systems? How do we pivot to provide food on a local, regional, national level in the event? And then what assets we have in place that can mitigate. So this is kind of, just a really crude graphic about where I think, like, at first blush, where we're gonna have different impacts. And really, I think I'm wrong already. Since our, when we see planting, so planting is probably our front row place, like we saw in the Gannon storm that we had impacts to planting. Harvesting, that's easy. You don't need GPS to harvest. You can see where you've harvested. The wheat is down. You don't have to worry about that. Processing, of course, that's completely dependent on a power grid, as is distribution of food stuff. So this is just kind of a conceptual framework that I think we have an opportunity to look at. All right. So one of the things that I am hoping that we can do is engage further discussions with the Extension Disaster Education Network, which is, it's kind of a national approach that tries to engage extension, which in Minnesota, we have extension in all 87 counties of the state. And that's really replicated throughout the United States. So how do we incorporate these ideas, and both for mitigation and response to solar storms within the Extension Disaster Education Network? I did have a small grant from them to start framing this issue, but it's going to take significantly more work. So that is all I have. And so if anybody had any questions, here's our newsletter. If you'd like to sign up, I'd love to have more folks. I probably will add you anyway.